Sireli hayranlıklar, inspesek, lavek, inşka inşiga, indorek. I'm so happy to be here, to be part of this celebration of the Mirror-Spectator's 85th anniversary. May it continue for 85 more years. I grew up in the shadow of genocide. My childhood was peopled by almost magical figures like Horsig Bajo and Madros Sukasyan and Ana Garabedyan and Simon Shimavonyan and Zartar Bajo and all of these incredible characters that went through an unforgettable experience that I wanted to uncover. I guess I was a kind of secret journalist even then, and I used to drive my mother crazy by always asking why did this happen? And particularly around the question of the genocide. Why were we in New York? Why were we living on East 87th Street between York and East End? Why did my father have a grocery store? What brought us here? And I never got any really definitive answers beyond cliches, Türkera hayvanen, eşeken, mezichen sirer marchen. Turks are, animals, they're donkeys, they're not human beings. Well, that was even then, to an unsophisticated, untrained kid, those were very unsatisfactory answers. I could see people kind of getting some kind of emotional charge from saying those kinds of things, but I wanted to know more. And I think that's influenced me throughout my career, such as it is in journalism, getting dirt under your fingernails, asking difficult questions. And our journalism here in the United States is very problematic. And I must say, to honor someone who's no longer with us, who had a great influence on me, was Ben Bagdikyan. He was born in Marash in 1920. He died last year at the ripe old age of 96. He wrote a very important book just about the time I started doing radio work. It was called The Media Monopoly. This is back in the late 70s, early 1980s. And Bagdikyan, he said, there's something happening to American media corporations. There are fewer and fewer of them, and the possibility of people getting real diverse sources of news is being slowly constrained. Well, his first book that came out had 50 corporations he identified as controlling most of the media in the United States. Well, he wrote subsequent editions of that book. 50 became 28, 28 became 23, 23 became 14, 14 became 10, 10 became 6, and today we have about 4 or 5 corporations that control most of what Americans see, hear, and read. And there's few regions of the world more misreported, more subject to propaganda than the Middle East. And I think the reasons should be fairly obvious, and this includes the Caucasus, by the way. I'm including the Caucasus as part of the Middle East. The reasons are quite clear. US hegemony that was injected into the region after the collapse of the British and French empires in 1945. The goal was to secure the oil reserves of what the State Department called the greatest strategic prize in the history of the world, the oil reserves of Saudi Arabia. And there was a fateful meeting of FDR and Ibn Saud on a US destroyer in the Suez Canal. I think it was on Valentine's Day in 1945. Roosevelt, who was already very sick, on his way back from Yalta, stops in the canal and meets with Ibn Saud, and there the Faustian bargain is struck. Okay, this is 3 years before the creation of the State of Israel. By the way, today is a very historic day. We're talking about history. 100 years ago, the Balfour Declaration was declared by the British Foreign Secretary, which resulted in a cascade of historical events, ultimately culminating in the creation of the State of Israel and the simultaneous dispossession and exile of the Palestinian people. We are still living with the consequences of that particular history. And last year, as you know, was the 100th anniversary of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The year before that, the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. And as I think, as Robert Fisk mentioned, it's what we are going to do in the coming years that counts and what we are doing right now. Amberin mentioned that Turkey is the empire of lies. I'm afraid the United States has that privileged position, particularly under an administration which in unparalleled ways has attacked my profession and the profession of my colleagues by calling us the enemy of the American people. Now, this should send shivers up everyone's spine because we recognize that language. We know that language from Stalin. We know it from Hitler's propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels, and we know it from Hitler himself. When people are then designated as enemies of the people, you know what is happening in terms of an evolving authoritarian rule here in the United States and elsewhere. So our profession is under attack. It does have a lot of things to answer for, of course, and I can talk a little bit more about that. But journalists everywhere are being murdered, they're being beaten. A Pakistani journalist was almost beaten to death just a couple of days ago in Islamabad. He's now in intensive care. And that reminded me of the last time I was in Islamabad. I thought I was going to meet some kind of similar fate when I was in the back of a taxi, and we were stopped at a red light, and two bearded men, okay, the cliche, pulled up right next to the taxi and were looking in the window and glaring at me, and I said, okay, this is it, you know, Ansad Zarab. It's all over. But fortunately, nothing happened. But there are so many journalists under attack. In India, which bills itself as the world's largest democracy, a very courageous journalist was murdered on September 5th, Gauri Lankesh. She was shot to death outside her home. She was known for her opposition to right-wing Hindu fundamentalism, which now controls the government of India and has since 2014. That's the Bharatiya Janata Party. She was murdered a couple of weeks after that, also in India, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about India. Shantanu Bhowmick, only 27 years old, murdered near Agartala in northeast India. There's been a separatist movement, which I'm sure very few of you are aware of, not just in Kashmir, which is in the northwest, but also in the northeast. Many of the peoples there have been very opposed to being ruled by New Delhi and seek some kind of self-determination and autonomy. But more recently publicized was the murder of Daphne Galicia in Malta, a woman, again, an investigative journalist, and apparently she was investigating corruptions implicating the Aliyev family of Azerbaijan. A particular bank drew her attention in Malta, which only had 100 depositors. It's kind of difficult to run a bank with only 100 people keeping money in it. But, it's one of these fake banks, let's say. And we have so many of them in the Cayman Islands and elsewhere. And she found that the number one client of this bank was the an Azerbaijani minister, followed by the son and daughter, Haidar and Leila, of the president of Azerbaijan. And she wrote in one of her last pieces, I'm quoting, "Azerbaijan is one of the world's most corrupt countries." Well, again, there's a lot of competition for that particular title. But even going back further, I remember, just being here with Robert. We were both at a memorial meeting in Beirut in early June 2005, because again, another journalist was murdered, Samir Kassir. 6 or 7 months after that, was it Ghassan Twaini, Robert? Yeah, Ghassan Twaini of An-Nahar was murdered. Hrant Dink, of course, in 2007. So our profession is now under attack, and to have inflammatory, inciting language coming from the President of the United States really puts us all in danger, because if journalism is the so-called, fourth estate, if we are to be a barrier or somehow insulating ourselves from the predations of runaway corporate predatory capitalism and a state that is becoming more and more authoritarian, we need to have a vibrant journalism. And I particularly subscribe to the old motto of journalism was to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. In this era, many journalists have flipped that, unfortunately, and they're comforting the afflicted. But I think that, even though I'm thinking about people like Thomas Friedman and David Brooks of the New York Times, people of that ilk, very establishment journalists who make millions of dollars, write books, get $500,000 advances, give lectures, and get hundreds of thousands of dollars. I think the ferocity of the Trump attack has even shaken them to their roots. And so they've been writing very, very uncharacteristically critical articles of the president. I mean, these are very status quo journalists. I call them lapdogs with laptops. They compete for the best hair on the air. They're very urbane. You see them on the NewsHour, on PBS, and of course on National Public Radio, and everybody thinks, they're very cool guys and who are giving us the, honest information. And I think, it's because they're able to use adverbs. Anyone old enough here to remember an adverb? They're able to use adverbs correctly and prepositions, and they don't yell. People speak in complete sentences. So it's quite a contrast, and this is the liberal media I'm talking about. It's quite a contrast to the talk radio and Fox type of yelling and screaming and banging the table and shouting, and no one really gets to complete an idea or a particular sentence. We are living in a time of genocide. That's what's happening to the Rohingya people in Myanmar. Why is there so little reporting on that in most of the media? Although in the last few weeks, there has been more coverage. On the BBC, there was a special report on what's happened to almost 1 million people who have been driven from their homes under horrific circumstances of rape and pillage and burning of villages. I mean, it sounds like a replay in some respects of the Armenian genocide. But in this case, you have a head of state who's a Nobel Peace Prize winner, who is a darling of the West, of Obama and others who welcomed her as this, incredible heroic figure. I'm talking about Aung San Suu Kyi, of course, who has remained absolutely silent while these atrocities are going on. This is totally unacceptable. She's been called out by no less than Bishop Desmond Tutu and other Nobel Prize winners like the 20-year-old Malala Yousafzai from Pakistan, that the Nobel Committee should strip her of her honor, as it were. Well, Nobel said we can't do that. There's nothing in their bylaws that allow anything like that. So, fake news. Let me tell you a little bit more about that with Iran, okay? Because now our great leader has, turned the Iran deal, which was working, by the way, according to all accounts, including an unimpeachable source, and that is the International Atomic Agency, Energy Agency in Vienna, which has gone to Iran and inspected sites there, not once, not twice, but 8 times, and they have concluded that Iran is in compliance with the agreement. This is to lift the sanctions that Iran had been subjected to in return for, that was the carrot that was offered to Iran, and then Iran would limit its centrifuge development. Now, there's been a lot of lying. It's not fake news. It's absolute propaganda and lying about what has been going on with Iran. For example, our great leader never tires of saying that we have given billions of dollars to Iran. This is beyond a falsehood. This is a total invention of a deluded mind. That money was seized was in US banks at the time of the Iranian Revolution when the Shah was overthrown in 1979, and it was Iranian money. It was money paid to US corporations for the delivery of F-4 fighter jets. So billions of dollars were in those accounts and were held. And as part of the deal with Iran, the money was returned to Tehran as it should have been. It wasn't our money, but the way Trump kind of parlayed it was it's coming out of our pockets, and we are supporting the Ayatollahs, in their skullduggery. Just one example of that, and the despicable UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina, even went to Vienna about a month ago trying to dig up information against Iran. Like, what do you got? Show me something. They must be in violation of the deal. She couldn't find anything, and she went back to New York with her head between her legs. So, or somewhere. That's not the right idiom. Sorry. Well, let's talk about another wonderful liberal democratic state known for its humanitarianism. Mention has been made of Turkey, such a pro-women regime. Saudi Arabia, a great American ally. The first country our great leader chose to visit. Again, going back to 1945, that was the deal that was sealed. We will protect the kingdom, the Saudi monarchy, as long as our corporations have access to Saudi oil. That was the deal, and that has remained in place. And so there's, our great leader doing the sword dance, this little mambo. It was pretty hilarious when you think about it. And, here you have a major violator of human rights carrying out war crimes and atrocities on a massive scale in Yemen. In fact, just a couple of days ago, yesterday's New York Times, buried in the back pages, under the fold, there's a small article about 25 civilians killed in Saudi air attack in Yemen. This is the same day that 8 people are killed in New York. Of course, front page news, photographs, we learn all about them, their parents, their interviews about them, what wonderful students they were. I'm not against any of those things. I think we should know about the victims. But why are some victims more worthy than other victims? That's a question that keeps coming up. We seem to prioritize victims. Some have tremendous status. For example, if an Israeli is killed, compare that with the death of a Palestinian. You don't have to be a journalism major or a political science major to figure this stuff out. You can do the work yourself. Just look at the printed page in front of you and see what is stressed, where are the photos placed, what do you learn about the victim in terms of humanizing that particular person, and what don't you learn? And I think, you'll come to certain conclusions. And, Saudi Arabia is in great respects responsible for the jihadi movement. It starts in Pakistan in the 1980s when they exported their virulent brand of Islam, Wahhabism, Salafism, and created then the Mujahideen, which Ronald Reagan called, compared to freedom fighters, said these were the equivalent to the founding fathers. I mean, he must have known something about the founding fathers. I don't know, maybe he did. But that's, it starts there. And, our journalists, I'm talking about US people, they're pretty good on the who, the what, the where, and the when. Like you'll find out everything you want to know about what just happened in New York or what happened here in your Boston Marathon attack, but you get very little of the why, almost no why. You'll never find any discussion of US foreign policy as it's conducted in the Middle East. the various interventions, the coups d'etats, the puppet governments, the autocratic regimes that we backed to the hilt, like Hosni Mubarak, who served, was running Egypt longer than Ramses II. And now we've got a new dictator in place who Trump invited to the White House and, again, has suppressed the press in Egypt, is holding an Al Jazeera reporter now for well over 300 days, and is committing all kinds of human rights violations. We're silent. The coffers are open again. Our pocketbooks are open. We're selling weapons to Sisi and to other dictators in the region and around the world. Rohingya is one genocide that's going on right now, and we should be speaking up because that's the right thing to do. It's the moral thing to do. The Yazidi people were targeted. I was in Armenia in June, and I must say the most interesting experience I had there was visiting an all Yazidi village. They all spoke Armenian fluently, perfectly, and it was very interesting to talk to them about Iraq and Syria and where many of them had come from and had now settled in Armenia. It was, I think, definitely the highlight of my visit there. Now, I want to circle back to my own experience, and that is dealing with the genocide, and mention was made that I spoke in Ankara. It was a very moving experience that I'd like to share with you because it was a large group, almost overwhelmingly of Kurds from Anatolia. There were some Turks there as well, and the feeling of solidarity and support was extraordinary and very heartening. I felt very uplifted. And it reminded me just a few years before that, every time I think of this, I choke up. I hope I can get through this without losing my breath. I went to Diyarbakir and I met the mayor there. And spontaneously, without any prompting from me, he apologized to me for what his grandparents and great-grandparents did to your people, he said. I had done nothing to cue him to ask, to make this apology. And then a couple days later, I went to Dicle, a nearby village north of Diyarbakir. I was looking for my mother's village, which I eventually found, which is all Zaza Kurd today, by the way. And there, the mayor of Dicle said to me, I'm so sorry about what happened. He said, I'm quoting, "Every time I meet an Armenian, I feel shame in my heart." I couldn't breathe. I just found that, so moving that he would, make that kind of offer to me. So I think, as Robert has said, not just tonight, but on a previous occasion when I heard him, we should be honoring our allies who stand with us, be they a Kurd or Turk, especially if they are Kurd or Turk, because there are many honorable examples that we should hold up and not fall back into a cliche of, well, they were all like that, and there were no good ones among them. So I'm going to read to you a little poem I wrote. I'll try and do it quickly. I know we're running out of time. It's called "A Century is a Long Time. It is and it isn't." It's important to complete the poems and eat the last pieces of lavash and bastech. Our grandparents are singing. Let's finish their songs. The lost child of Bitlis cries out, "Mairig, Mairig, Ures, Menagem, Gavachnam." Mother, mother, where are you? I'm all alone and I'm afraid. Those who control the past control the present. Those who control the past control the future. Orwell. The struggle of humankind against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. The assassination of Allende quickly covered up the memory of the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia. The bloody massacre in Bangladesh caused Allende to be forgotten. The din of war in the Sinai drowned out the groans of Bangladesh. The massacres in Cambodia caused the Sinai to be forgotten, and so on, and so on, and on, and on, until everyone has completely forgotten everything. Milan Kundera, the great Czech writer from The Laughter of Books and Forgetting. The past is never dead. It's not even past. William Faulkner. Yergir, homeland, water so clean, air so pure, fruits and vegetables so tasty. So survivors of the genocide told me, maybe with some exaggeration. Yergir, a magical place full of wonder and cruelties. Bedros, my father, was born in 1895 in the village of Nibishi near Palu during the Hamadian massacres. In the same year, his father, Barsam, that's my grandfather, disappeared, never to be seen again. Bedros left Yergir in 1912. 80 years later, he is hit and killed by a car on 87th Street and First Avenue in New York, just a block from where I grew up. The car was driven by a Turk. When I told my sister what happened, she said, Jagadakir. It's Armenian for, it is written on your forehead. Turkey, a crime scene. No more Enver and Talat statues and streets. No more pretending it didn't happen. No more macho posturing. Liberate yourselves, Turks, from twisted and toxic nationalist narratives. Ambassador Morgenthau, where are the Armenians heading? Talat, their destination is the abyss. My mother Araksi remembered in early 1915 there was a plague of locusts in her village of Daphne. The elders said it was a bad omen. The death march. The ground was so hot, my feet were burning, Sarkis Hagopian told me. We were so hungry, we ate unripened fruit. We were so thirsty, we wet our parched lips with horse's urine. My mother told me those things. The last time she saw her mother and brothers was in Urfa. We, the keepers of memories and dreams, keep coming up like weeds to remind you and ourselves of the past. A faded but dear landscape drenched in blood, the burning of books and churches. We live in their ashes, but we must transcend those ashes to create a new reality. To quote Kenneth Rescroft, a wonderful American writer, against the ruin of the world, there's only one defense, the creative act. Let us play again in our gardens and fields and glory in the beauty of the flowers forever. A century is a long time. It is and it isn't. Bari Janapar, safe travels. Shunara Galem. Thank you.